Welcome to Democracy Does, the Civic Power Playbook, a podcast that cuts through the noise to explain what's really happening in our democracy. Each episode breaks down key issues with insight from policy experts and change makers, giving you clear tips to take action. Whether you're fired up or feeling stuck, you're in the right place to get informed and get inspired, because democracy works best when we all participate. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Democracy Does, the Civic Power Playbook. We all know voting isn't just a civic duty. It is how we shape the policies that affect our daily lives, from our healthcare to education to economic opportunity. Now, many of us are understanding more and more that it does, in fact, matter. Today, we're breaking down the SAVE Act, proposed legislation that's aimed at tightening voter registration requirements and access to the ballot box. To help us unpack it all, we are joined by Greta Bedekovics. She is the Director of Democracy Policy for the Center for American Progress. Greta, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is such an important issue, so I'm really glad that you're highlighting it.
Thank you. And we really wanted to do that because we hear the term batted around in the news, and I don't know if a lot of people understand what it is. Can you explain what the SAVE Act is? And it stands for the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. What is it? What does it mean? Explain.
So in its simplest form, the SAVE Act is voter suppression legislation. We know this because we've seen similar laws implemented in states at the state level. So we really don't guess how this would have to play out. But the SAVE Act would really upend the way all American citizens register to vote and potentially block millions from the ballot box. It would do this because currently, if you register to vote, you can use a driver's license or your social security number. But if the SAVE Act went into effect, Americans would have to rely on their passport or their birth certificate to register to vote, and they would have to do this in person. And that might sound easy to a lot of people, but we know at the Center for American Progress, we've done data on this, as have others, that half of American citizens don't have a passport. So right off the bat, this poses a challenge to millions who might have to pay $165 to get a passport. Now we're basically looking at a poll tax. And then if you're going to use your birth certificate, we also see that millions of married women who've changed their name from their maiden name don't have birth certificates that match their current legal name and would face additional hurdles voting under the SAVE Act. And that's not to mention that the in-person voter requirement would then force working Americans to take time off of work to register to vote, not just to vote, right, but just to register to vote. And then, of course, we see rural Americans driving hours and hours to get to their election office. So really no way, any way you cut this, we're going to see Americans face additional hurdles. We're going to see people disenfranchised. And when Kansas tried to pass a similar law a decade ago, 32,000 people were blocked from the ballot box. So we're not talking here about hypotheticals. We know how the SAVE Act would play out. Republican senators pushing this bill have seen how it would play out in their own states, and yet they've continued to go ahead and try and pass this legislation vehemently for the last year or so.
Okay, you just dropped some major, just mind-blowing stats and figures about this. So I want to go back and make sure I understand this. Right now, how can someone register to vote? What's the standard practice right now?
The standard practice right now in many states is it's very easy to do online or to do it at your DMV. So you can typically go to your Secretary of State website or your local county election office website and fill out a form online. And it's going to typically ask you either for your driver's license number or the last four digits of your social security number as a security layer. And that gives election officials the information that they need to verify your identity and then to check your eligibility based on state requirements as well as federal requirements, including for citizenship. And then they add you to the voter rolls. Election officials have invested, millions of dollars in time to make this process as easy for Americans as possible, right? With the invention of the internet, they moved the process online. If you go to the DMV and renew your license, you can do it there as well. But if the SAVE Act went into place, you'd essentially be forced to go to your county election office and do this in person. So you can't do it from your couch anymore. You can't just do it on a whim. You basically have to take time out of your day, time off of work, and then also get all of your documents in place and basically convince your election official that you are who you say you are and that you're a citizen. And then they make the judgment of whether or not they believe that you are eligible and whether your documents are legit and requirements, and then would place you on the rolls.
Wait a minute. So even if you came with these documents that are very difficult for some people to get, they would still have the right to determine if it's legitimate enough to put you to register you. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that the problem with this bill, well, one of the many problems, is that it places basically the burden on election officials to make the judgment as to whether or not your documents appear valid, right? Like not everybody's birth certificate, depending on the county that you're from, is going to look the same. And so they're essentially left to adjudicate these documents. And so same thing for married women, somebody who might have, a Jane Doe sounding last name, if it doesn't match their birth certificate on their ID, if it's a white person, a white woman, they might let it slide. But if you have a non-white sounding name, they might raise a lot of questions and ask for additional documentation. And so it places a lot of discretion on election officials. And it's worrisome too, because under the bill, they could be prosecuted and even facing prison time if they look at documents incorrectly. And so they're not going to want to be taking that risk on themselves. So they would be looking at documents very, very strictly because they don't want to be personally liable, personally sued for it accepting incorrect documentation. And so that's a huge part of this bill as well, is it's basically making American citizens convince the government that they are a citizen.
And even I read that even if you have a military ID, that wouldn't be sufficient. Is that true?
Correct. A military ID alone would not be sufficient. So if you register to vote, again, that's something that you can use today to prove your identity and prove your eligibility. But non-citizens can serve in the U.S. military. So at face value, that is not proof of citizenship. You'd either have to present it with a birth certificate or an additional record showing that you were born in the U.S. And so I actually went to a rally recently where a veteran had spoken, recounting his years of service. Now he registered to vote many times on military bases using his ID. And the idea that you could have this ID that can let you into secure military sites all across the U.S. internationally, and now that would not be enough for you to register to vote, is absolutely ludicrous.
I want to go back to the issue with women too, because what's very unnerving is you're making it so much difficult for a huge swath of the population to not be able to vote. So what if you don't know where your birth certificate is? What if your family is all the way on the other side of the country and you don't have access to it? How are you supposed to get it? What are you supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, if this bill passed, I think it would essentially set off like a nationwide search among Americans for all of these documents. I mean, you'd be forced to pay for it, right? If you live in a different state, maybe your family would have to mail you your birth certificate. Again, it's a certified original copy of your birth certificate. I was just talking to some friends and colleagues too who have those little like printed cards or laminated cards of their birth certificate. That is not an original certified copy of your birth certificate, right? So this is like the document you were issued that your mother is probably holding on to somewhere in a safe that you are going to need. If you don't have it, you're going to have to buy it from your county. It typically costs between $10 and $30. Some counties require you to go in person to get an original certified copy of your birth ticket. So imagine you're living in California, but you were born in Oklahoma. It might force you to go back to the county you were born, where maybe you haven't lived since you were 2, to get a certified original copy of your birth certificate just to register to vote, or update your registration information as well. Because that's the thing, right? This bill doesn't just affect you register to vote for the first time. It affects you anytime you move, you need to make an update. If you get married and legally change your name, you need to update your registration. So this bill would affect Americans throughout the entire course of their lives, not just when they register to vote for the first time when they turn 18.
How often do you have to refresh your registrations to vote? How often does that happen?
So it should be every time you move. So even if you're in an apartment complex, if you change units, that's typically a registration update. If you move down the block, if you move into, a senior retirement facility, I
Yes.
mean, these all count as moves. College students also move often. And again, for many women who marry and change their last name, they're going to have to update their registration. And people think that this might not impact them, or that it wouldn't impact, millions of Americans every election cycle. But we have data from the Federal U.S. Election Assistance Commission showing that there are between 80 and 100 million American citizens who register to vote for every federal election cycle. That's between a third and half of the entire electorate who would be affected by this bill every election cycle.
And can you go back and talk about, because those numbers are so significant. We're talking about all these women, and we're talking about communities that may have a financial burden in, as you said, accessing a passport. Can you talk about how this targets poorer communities and communities of color? You touched on it briefly, but if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one, it has the financial burdens of any of these documents costing money. But when we also, for example, look at passport ownership, right? We see that Americans making less than $50,000 and of lower economic backgrounds are less likely to have a passport because they're not traveling internationally, right? And now they'd have to pay $165 to get it. Many of these people are also working 9 to 5. If they have to register in person, even the fact that they have to do that is going to be a huge barrier because they might have to take time off of work. I mean, their employers are not providing them, paid time off to go vote. Now they're going to have to do that just to register to vote. I mean, think even of like, a mom juggling daycare and kids and schedules and taking time off of that or providing childcare just to go to the election office to register to vote. So it's both placing, economic burdens on people and having to acquire the materials that they don't have, but then also the time out of their day or work schedules to actually go and complete the procedure registering to vote now.
I appreciate you explaining that and breaking that down because there are some people who would challenge and say, well, this isn't that big of a deal. This will keep Americans safe from and prevent voter fraud. I had read a stat, however, that said there was something like 0.04% of fraud that even existed, that it was infinitesimally small. But explain to me, what do you say to people who believe that this will keep the voting process safer?
I mean, I definitely would start with pointing out just how absolutely rare voter fraud is. And particularly here, too, right? This bill is meant to address non citizen voter fraud. So that's the idea that somebody would make an attempt to come to this country to build a better life here and then risk that to cast one vote. So I think
Hmm.
on surface level, it sounds unreasonable and not like something that we would want to do. It's also far fewer than 0.04. So the Heritage
Really?
Foundation, right, behind Project 2025 has a tracker looking at instances of voter fraud, including non citizen fraud. And in the last 25 years of elections, so a quarter century, they found 100 instances of non citizen voting across the country in all federal elections. That's like 0.704%. So like it's not
Even
even, you
smaller
can't
than
even
that.
round it up to a
Let me make
percent.
sure I have understand that. So of how many years, and they only found 100
100
incidents?
instances, not even all those instances are somebody casting a ballot. There's some people registering to vote in error because, right, they were misled. But 1.5 billion ballots were cast just in general elections. So out of 100 of those, they're purportedly saying that those could be instances of fraud out of 1.5 billion ballots. And for
Billion.
that, they want to change billion with a B, want to change the way all American citizens register to vote. So that itself is ludicrous. I mean, Mike Lee is leading this bill in the Senate. Election officials in his state just completed a review of voters in the state, 2.1 million voter files they looked at, and didn't find a single instance of a non citizen having voted. And yet
Not
he
a
wants to make it
single
hard.
instance.
Not a single instance of a non citizen having cast a ballot. And yet he wants to make it harder to vote for 2.1 million Utahns and people across the nation. So I think those are good stats to just keep in mind, like how, like why they're trying to dig up, this disinformation about our elections. And when I look at these numbers, again, I go back to Kansas and say, we're talking about 100 potential non-citizens voting out of 1.5 billion ballots cast. But Kansas shows us that if this went into law, in Kansas, 32,000 American citizens were blocked from voting. So, like, the math is like not mathing, right?
No,
No matter which
right.
way you slice it. And when we're talking about American citizens facing obstacles to the ballot, that's what people should be concerned about.
So let's talk about I do want to talk briefly just about the work you do, because I think a lot of people, they don't realize how troubling this is and how damaging it can be and what it could mean, the long-term effects. Tell me a little bit more about the role you play in your position.
So, as a director of democracy, I mean, I think my role has changed a lot in the past year. Worked a great deal of my career to advancing voting rights, promoting bills that would make it easier for Americans to vote.
Mm.
But obviously, in the last few years, we've really been in a defensive posture trying to protect basic freedoms, the basic right to vote, and making sure that our democracy is not being crumbled, into authoritarianism. And I think, for example, the SAVE Act is one way that the administration is trying to make that happen. I mean, at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is take power away from the people to decide the outcome of elections so that they can stay in power, so that they can escape accountability. And that's what we're seeing through so many different facets of our democracy. And so people have been saying, that it really is a five-alarm fire, and that's the way that we're seeing it. I mean, they've they've made it so clear that they're trying to rig elections in order to stay in power and escape accountability. And so if they can get away with this with the SAVE Act and other things this year, it's really just setting the course for what they're going to try and do in 2028. And so this is really is a critical midterm election. And you can just tell, I mean, Trump signed an executive order on Tuesday to try and, set federal rules for elections again. And so for the last year that they've been in power, just been trying every avenue to really manipulate how our elections are run. And so our day to day is trying to bat that down through their different ways to try doing it through administration, through Congress, and through the states. So it's been a very, very busy year. And I would love to, at some point get back to making democracy better, but we're really just in this defensive mode right now.
And that leads me to my next point is what is what is the status of the SAVE Act now? What is the status? Because I think people want to know where are we with this? You tell the story about Kansas and that's frightening. So where
It's
is it?
very frightening. Yeah. So after months and months of very hard, good work from so many advocates and so many Americans calling members of Congress, it looks like the SAVE Act has stalled a bit in the Senate, which is a huge sigh of relief to many, many people. After 2 weeks of debate between Republicans and Democrats on the bill, they went out for Easter recess without having voted on it. Towards the end, it seemed like Republicans may have worked out a deal where they would try and get the SAVE Act through budget reconciliation and not try and do it through the floor, not try to amend the filibuster to do this, but rather do it through the Department of Homeland Security's reconciliation process, which again would require 50 votes. That seems very scary, but my take on that is generally that Republicans were trying to get, Trump to drop the bone on the SAVE Act and let through DHS funding and the partial shutdown fund TSA, and that they're trying to kind of move the ball further down the field with the SAVE Act. So we're definitely not out of the woods yet, but it seems stalled. And I think when you look at Republican speeches for the SAVE Act and the fact that not many members spoke on it, they were not very impassioned speeches. The fact that Senator Murkowski came down to the floor to oppose the SAVE Act and talk about the huge burdens it would mean for Alaskans, like purchasing $1,000 flight just to get to your election office.
That's what it would be
Absolutely.
like in Alaska. Some people in rural areas would have to purchase a flight to get to their election offices to register in person.
Absolutely. They have 5 election offices for their bureaus. So you have people who have to take a 20-hour ferry or maybe an hour flight that still costs $440 round trip because it's Alaska. And again, not just the first time they register to vote, but if they get married or move, they would have to make that trip.
They'd
So
have to
they're
do it
really in
again.
disarray. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow. I don't think people realize, again, the burden that plays. And w- that type of hurdle, I believe, makes things so much harder because I'm sure you have seen in your work, it's hard enough to mobilize people to get them to vote, period. Um, so in your opinion, I like to end on a hopeful note. I try to be positive in terms of what people can do, in terms of being informed, feeling like there's something that they can do, that they have agency. What would you recommend, Greta? 3 tips that you would give someone who is listening about why they should care or what they should do about this or how they can empower themselves or others.
I think people should definitely care about this because elections at the end of the day are the bedrock of our democracy and how we hold elected leaders accountable. That has never been more needed than now. And they're fighting so hard to take that power away because they are scared of the power of the American people. And we can reclaim that through elections. I think everybody absolutely has to keep that in mind. I would definitely say call your member of Congress still, call your senator about the SAVE Act because this fight is not over and they want to hear from you. And we've driven about almost close to 1 million calls actually to Congress on this piece of legislation, which is fantastic throughout the last year. So we know Americans truly, truly care about this. They want to hear from you on it. That's why Senator Murkowski came out against this bill because she was being, Alaskans are calling her about what this would mean
Wow,
for her. So it absolutely makes an impact.
that's
So
great.
please call your member of Congress. And I would say too, I mean, we just had, No Kings protests all around the country. Those also face, had serious undertones of the importance of our democracy, of the importance of the right to vote. And I think I'm also from Minnesota, a state that very much stood up to the administration. The No Kings protest there was absolutely huge. I think it's a very much proof that people do take to the streets. Even this administration is accountable and has to answer to the people. And so I do think that sustained protesting is incredibly, incredibly important. And again, they would not be trying to take away people's power if they didn't know that the people had power.
That's outstanding. And then just for anyone else who, say you're not the type who wants to protest or you get nervous calling on the phone, is there anything else you can do to shore up and make sure that you are just equipped and ready? Like, is there anything on your website or any other resources that someone could use to be prepared for this situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'd encourage everybody to check out Center for American Progress, americanprogress.org, and check out our resources on the SAVE Act. We do a lot of quick explainers about the documents that you would need if the bill went into effect, things that you should be checking on if you potentially have. You can look at, our state-by-state breakdown for the number of Americans that do and don't have passports in each state, the number of married women that would be impacted. We also did a project looking at some of the longest drive times that Americans would face getting to their election office. So if you live in a state like Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho, these are good resources to check out because you could potentially be living in one of those counties that would force you to drive 7-8 hours to get to your election office. So we've really tried to provide resources that break down this bill for all communities, and these are resources that you can find at americanprogress.org that I would encourage everybody to check out.
That's outstanding. And any final advice, just as the midterms are going to be coming up, we're gearing up for this election season. Anything else that you really want the public to know? Because again, people say, "Oh, I just had a conversation with someone that I knew who said, "Oh, do protests really matter?" And I say, that visibility, that presence, that noise means we're paying attention. But is there anything else that you would tell people to do in terms of being prepared as the midterms approach, or why it's important to participate in the midterms as it approaches?
I think the one thing Americans should really keep in mind is developing a plan. We always say is develop a plan for how you're going to cast your ballot, right?
Yes.
This year, I think it's more important than ever that everybody casts their ballot in a way that makes them feel safe and secure and makes their families feel safe and secure. So in past years, maybe that meant that you were going to your polling location in person because that's the way you've always voted, right? But we are hearing rumors about potential ICE at polling locations or, the National Guard and things like that Trump administration might try and pull in. So I think it's really, really important to make the registration is updated. You know that you're registered to vote. You're checking on that before the midterm, before the general election, and then making a good and concrete plan for how you're going to cast your ballot safely and sticking to it.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Greta Bedekovics, did I say that correctly? Okay. Who is the Director of Democracy Policy for the Center for American Progress. Thank you so much. And where can people go to find more, to see those tools that you mentioned, those reference points? What's the best website to go to?
The best website is americanprogress.org, and you can also check us out on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, X, Blue Sky, TikTok, all the social media apps, and we do great explainer breakdowns of the SAVE Act as well. And I've highlighted some great speeches from members of Congress about the impacts as well.
Terrific. So americanprogress.org. Thank you so much for your important work and for sharing this with us.
Thanks for having me, Robin.
And now it's time to recap Greta's top 3 power plays. First, she says, call your member of Congress and voice concern about this piece of legislation. Also, she says, check your voter registration and make sure it's up to date. And finally, she says, stay informed, stay vocal, and have a voting plan. And to learn more, especially how you'll be impacted in your community, you can go to americanprogress.org. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you're feeling a little more hopeful, a little less stuck, and maybe even inspired to take action, because democracy does work when we all participate. And don't forget, sign up for our newsletter to get updates on when our next episode drops. You can go to my website, democracydoes.com. And as a bonus, if you haven't gotten one, a free and easy tip sheet on how to get involved.